The dinner party at the penthouse was flawless. Crystal stems catching the Manhattan lights, the hum of expensive conversation, and my wife Elena glowing in the center of it all. But the illusion shattered not with a scream, but with the silent, terrifying vibration of her phone on the marble counter and a preview message from her boss that was far too intimate for a Tuesday night. I didn't confront her. I simply realized that the woman I loved was a stranger, and strangers don't deserve a goodbye. If you are drawn to stories where silence cuts deeper than words and the long game of justice is worth the wait, stay with me, because the vanishing is just the beginning. The rain in New York didn't wash things clean. It just made the grime slicker, reflecting the neon distortion of the city lights against the floor-to-ceiling windows of our Tribeca apartment. I stood by the kitchen island, a half-empty glass of Merlot in my hand, listening to the sound of the shower running in the master bathroom. It was a domestic sound, usually comforting. Elena was washing off the day, a day she had told me was filled with back-to-back strategy meetings and a late client dinner at Le Bernardin. Her phone, lying face-up on the marble counter next to her keys, buzzed. I wouldn't have looked. I never looked. We had the kind of marriage built on implied trust, or so I thought. But the buzz was persistent, a rapid-fire staccato that suggested urgency. I glanced down, expecting to see her mother's name or perhaps an emergency alert from the building management. The screen lit up, cutting through the dim, ambient light of the kitchen. Sender, Marcus Thorne. Message, you left your earring on my nightstand. I'm keeping it. The scent of you is still on my sheets. The glass in my hand didn't break. I didn't gasp. The world didn't tilt on its axis. Instead, a strange, cold clarity washed over me, instantly freezing the blood in my veins. It was a physical sensation, like stepping out of a warm house into a blizzard without a coat. Marcus, her CEO, the man who had slapped me on the back at the Christmas party 2 weeks ago, praising my patience with Elena's long hours. Another buzz. Sender. Marcus Thorne. Message. He doesn't suspect a thing, Elle. Stop worrying. See you at the office. I set the wine glass down. My hand was remarkably steady. The shower stopped. I heard the squeak of the glass door opening, then the muffled sound of Elena humming a tune. Something soft and light, completely at odds with the devastation sitting on the kitchen counter. I looked around the apartment, the Architectural Digest living room, the photos of us in Bali and Paris lining the hallway, the life we had curated for 7 years. It all felt like a stage set now. Props, fake walls. If I stayed, I would shout. I would demand answers. She would cry, she would lie. She would say it was a mistake, or that she was confused. Then we would enter the long, humiliating purgatory of counseling and trying to make it work, where I would have to look at her every day and wonder if she was thinking of him. No. The realization was absolute. The Elena I loved didn't exist. She had died the moment I read that text. The woman in the bathroom was a stranger who had been sleeping in my bed. I walked to the bedroom, moving quietly on the balls of my feet. I pulled my Tumi carry-on from the top shelf of the closet. I didn't pack clothes. I packed my passport, my laptop, the external hard drive with my portfolio, and the cash I kept in the safe for emergencies. Ethan? Her voice called out from the bathroom, muffled by the towel she was likely wrapping around her hair. Did you pour me a glass? Just letting it breathe, I said. My voice sounded hollow, distant, like a recording played in an empty room. I walked back to the kitchen. I took off my wedding band. It was platinum, simple, heavy. I placed it directly on top of her phone, circling the notification that was still glowing faintly. I didn't write a note. What was there to say? The text message said it all. He doesn't suspect a thing. I walked to the door, grabbed my coat, and stepped out into the hallway. I didn't look back. I didn't slam the door. I closed it with a soft, definitive click. The elevator ride down took 45 seconds. In that time, Ethan Vance, the devoted husband, ceased to exist. By the time the doors opened to the lobby and the doorman nodded his nightly greeting, I was already a ghost. I walked out into the rain, hailed a cab, and gave the driver the only destination that made sense. JFK, I said. International Terminal. The city blurred past the window, a smear of red taillights and broken promises. I wasn't just leaving my marriage. I was vanishing. The silence in the apartment was heavy, a physical weight that pressed against Elena's eardrums as she stepped out of the bathroom. The air smelled of her expensive lavender body scrub and the faint, lingering aroma of the Merlot she had asked for. "Ethan," she called out, toweling her hair. "Did you verify the reservation for Friday?" No answer. She walked into the kitchen, her bare feet silent on the hardwood. The lights were dimmed low. The bottle of wine stood open, breathing on the counter. Beside it, a single glass sat empty, pristine, untouched. And there, resting directly on top of her illuminated phone screen, was a circle of platinum. Elena stopped. Her breath hitched in her throat. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the wedding band. It was cold. Beneath it, the screen was dark now, but as she tapped it, the notification history stared back at her. The preview of Marcus's text was still there, a digital smoking gun. "I'm keeping it. The scent of you is still on my sheets." A wave of nausea rolled through her. He had seen it. He hadn't screamed, hadn't thrown the glass against the wall, hadn't dragged her into a fight she had been subconsciously rehearsing for months. He had simply erased himself. She ran to the closet. The gap on the top shelf where his luggage usually sat looked like a missing tooth. His drawers were open, void of the essentials but leaving behind the sentimental clutter, photos, books, gifts, as if they meant nothing to him anymore. "Ethan!" She screamed his name then, the sound tearing through the perfect acoustics of the apartment, answered only by the hum of the refrigerator. 2 days later, the police detective stood in the center of her living room, looking bored. He closed his notebook with a snap that sounded like a judgment. "Mrs. Vance, your husband's passport was scanned at JFK International 48 hours ago. He withdrew a significant amount of cash from your joint safe deposit box, which he had access to, and his personal accounts have been closed." The detective looked around the opulent room, his eyes landing on Elena's pale face. "He didn't meet with foul play. He left. There's a difference." "He wouldn't just leave," Elena whispered, though she knew it was a lie. "Without a word?" "Men leave, ma'am," the detective said, putting his pen away. "Sometimes they just walk out." When the door closed behind the officer, the reality settled in. She was not a widow. She was something worse, a woman discarded without a backward glance. Marcus arrived an hour later. He didn't knock. He used the spare key she had given him a month ago, a violation she had permitted in the thrill of the affair. He found her sitting on the floor of the closet, holding one of Ethan's old sweaters. "He's gone, Elle," Marcus said. His voice wasn't gentle, it was pragmatic. He crouched down, taking the sweater from her hands and tossing it into a corner. "Stop acting like this is a tragedy. It's a solution." "He saw the texts," she said, her voice shaking. He knows what we did." "He saw the texts and he ran," Marcus corrected, pulling her to her feet. His grip was firm, possessive. "A strong man would have fought for you. A strong man would have punched me in the face." "Ethan?" He folded. He ran away because he knew he couldn't compete. Marcus cupped her face, forcing her to look at him. His eyes were dark, confident, devoid of any guilt. "You didn't lose anything that was real, Elena. You just shed some dead weight. Now you and I can stop hiding. We can build the empire we talked about." Elena looked into Marcus's eyes, desperate for absolution. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Ethan's silence was cowardice, not dignity. Because if it was dignity, then she was the villain in this story. "Okay," she whispered, leaning into him. "Okay." She let Marcus lead her out of the bedroom, away from the empty spaces Ethan had left behind. Weeks turned into months. Months bled into years. Ethan's name was spoken less and less, eventually becoming a taboo subject at dinner parties. Elena removed the photos from the hallway. Marcus moved in. They merged their assets. They merged their lives. Sterling Media grew. Elena became a partner. They were the power couple of the Manhattan media circuit, feared, admired, and envied. The apartment was redecorated in sharper, colder tones. But sometimes, late at night, when the city was quiet and Marcus was asleep beside her, Elena would stare at the ceiling. She would remember the silence of that first night. Ethan hadn't just left the apartment. He had vanished so completely that it felt like he was waiting. Like the silence wasn't an end, but a deep breath before a scream. 7 years passed in a blur of ambition and champagne, until the letter from the board of directors arrived, announcing the hostile takeover bid from Janus Capital. The void was about to be filled. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Sterling Media was essentially a glass cage suspended over Midtown Manhattan. 7 years ago, this room had been a symbol of Marcus's virility and Elena's ascent. Today, it felt like an execution chamber. Elena sat at the long mahogany table, her fingers tracing the rim of a water bottle she was too nauseous to drink from. The financials projected on the screen behind her were bleeding red. Sterling Media was drowning in debt, bad acquisitions, and a market that had moved faster than Marcus's ego could keep up with. "Stop fidgeting, Elena," Marcus snapped. He was standing by the window, adjusting his cufflinks for the third time. He looked older. The last 7 years had etched deep lines around his mouth, and his once charming arrogance had curdled into a brittle, defensive nastiness. "These Janus Capital people are just money men, vultures. They need us as much as we need them." "They're buying 80% of the company, Marcus," Elena said, her voice tired. "They don't need us. They own us." "They own the debt," he corrected, turning to glare at her. "I still run the show. The CEO of Janus, whoever the hell he is, won't bother with day-to-day operations. He's probably some old money ghost who lives in Switzerland." The double doors swung open. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. A team of 4 lawyers entered first, moving with the synchronized precision of a military unit. They wore charcoal suits and carried identical leather folios. They didn't smile. They didn't offer handshakes. They simply lined up along the side of the room, silent sentinels preparing the way. "Gentlemen," Marcus said, stepping forward with his practiced salesman smile, extending a hand that no one took. "We were expecting your principal." "Mr. Thorne," the lead attorney said. His voice was dry as paper. "Our CEO prefers to make his own entrances. Please take your seat." It wasn't a request. Marcus stiffened, his jaw tightening, but he sat down next to Elena. Under the table, his knee was bouncing nervously. Elena felt a strange prickle on the back of her neck, a primal instinct, the kind an animal feels when the wind changes direction before a storm. Then, the doors opened again. He didn't stomp in. He didn't stride with the performative energy Marcus always used. The man walked in with a fluid, predatory grace, his footsteps on the plush carpet making no sound. He wore a bespoke navy suit that fit him like a second skin, cut to emphasize broad shoulders and a lean, powerful frame. He stopped at the head of the table. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the view. He placed a single, slim tablet on the mahogany surface and looked up. Elena stopped breathing. The face was sharper, the jawline hardened as if chiseled from granite. The soft, artistic gaze of the architect she had married was gone, replaced by eyes that were dark, abyssal, and utterly cold. His hair was shorter, styled with severe precision, flecked with distinguished gray at the temples that hadn't been there 7 years ago. Time seemed to warp. The hum of the projector vanished. The city noise faded. There was only the ringing in Elena's ears. Beside her, Marcus froze. His mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. He looked like a man trying to process a hallucination. "Ethan?" Elena whispered. The name scraped her throat, barely audible. Ethan Vance didn't flinch. He didn't blink. He looked at Elena, then at Marcus, with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining insects under a microscope. There was no love, no hate, no anger, just a terrifying, absolute zero. "I believe," Ethan said, his voice deeper, resonating with a timbre of authority that commanded the oxygen in the room. "We have some restructuring to discuss." He pulled out the chair at the head of the table, Marcus's chair, and sat down. "Shall we begin?" The ghost had not just returned. He had come to collect the rent. The silence following Ethan's question hung in the air like smoke. Marcus was the first to break it, his survival instinct kicking in with a clumsy, desperate attempt at familiarity. "Ethan," Marcus stammered, a nervous chuckle escaping his lips. He stood up halfway, then sat back down, unsure of the choreography. "My God, it's been... we thought you were... This is unexpected. Look, whatever happened in the past..." "Mr. Thorne," Ethan cut in. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The tone was level, stripped of any warmth, the kind of voice used to dictate autopsy reports. "We are not here to discuss the past. We are here to discuss the fact that Sterling Media has burned through $40 million in operating capital in the last 3 quarters. Ethan tapped the tablet in front of him. The screen behind him shifted instantly, displaying a brutal red-lined graph of the company's stock performance. "Your acquisition of the Kleiner stream was ill-advised," Ethan continued, his eyes locked on Marcus. "You over-leveraged the company assets based on projected growth that never materialized. Amateur." The word hung there. Amateur. Elena watched Marcus flinch. In 7 years, she had never seen anyone speak to Marcus like that. He was the king of his little world, surrounded by yes-men and sycophants. Now he looked small. He looked like a child being scolded by a principal. "The market was volatile," Marcus argued, his face reddening. "We took a risk. That's business." "That's gambling," Ethan corrected. "And you lost. Janus Capital is stepping in not as a partner, but as a savior, which means I call the shots. Effective immediately, all executive expenditures over $5,000 require my direct counter-signature. The marketing budget is frozen, and the merger with Kleiner is under review." "You can't freeze marketing," Elena spoke up, her voice trembling slightly. It was the first time she had addressed him directly. "We have the fall campaigns launching next week. If we stop now, we lose the seasonal window." Ethan turned his head slowly to look at her. For a heartbeat, Elna hoped to see a flicker of recognition. Anger, pain, anything. But his eyes were dark mirrors, reflecting only her own anxiety back at her. "Ms. Vance," he said, using her maiden name. The sound of it was a precise, surgical strike. He knew she used Thorn professionally now. He was stripping her of that identity. "The campaigns are derivative. I reviewed the decks this morning. They lack vision. Pause them." "But—" "Pause them," he repeated. It wasn't a debate. Ethan stood up. The meeting was over because he decided it was over. The lawyers snapped their folios shut in unison. "I expect a revised restructuring plan on my desk by 8 a.m. tomorrow," Ethan said, buttoning his jacket. "Do not disappoint me." He turned and walked toward the door. The air in the room seemed to rush out with him. "Ethan!" Elena pushed back her chair and ran after him. Marcus grabbed her wrist. "Let him go, Elle. Don't!" She ripped her arm free and hurried into the corridor. Ethan was already halfway down the hall, flanked by his legal guard. "Ethan, please!" she called out, ignoring the heads turning in the open plan office. He stopped. He didn't turn around immediately. He said something to one of the lawyers, who nodded and stepped aside. Then slowly, Ethan turned. Elena caught up to him, breathless. Up close, he was even more intimidating. The scent of him was different. Gone was the cedar and sawdust of the architect. Now he smelled of sandalwood and cold, crisp winter air. Expensive. Distant. "You can't just walk in here and dismantle everything," she whispered, searching his face. "Why are you doing this? Is this about us?" Ethan looked down at her. He checked his watch. A Patek Philippe that cost more than her car. "You overestimate your importance in my portfolio, Elena," he said softly. "This is a business transaction. Sterling Media is a failing asset with potential. I'm here to fix the asset." "I don't believe you," she said, tears prickling her eyes. "You disappeared. You left me." "I left a stranger," Ethan said. His voice dropped, just loud enough for her to hear, intimate yet terrifying. "And I returned to find 2 employees who are bad at their jobs. Have that report on my desk or update your resume." He turned his back on her and walked toward the executive elevator. The doors slid open, he stepped in, and without a backward glance, he pressed the button for the lobby. Elena stood alone in the hallway, the ding of the elevator echoing like a final gavel. The humiliation didn't come with a shout. It came with a memo. At 7 a.m. on Monday, 3 days after the acquisition was finalized, Elena arrived at Sterling Media to find 2 men in blue jumpsuits clearing out her corner office. Her awards, her framed degrees, and the orchid she had meticulously kept alive for 3 years were sitting in cardboard boxes in the hallway. "What are you doing?" she demanded, dropping her dripping umbrella. "This is my office." "Not anymore," a voice said from behind her. She turned to see Ethan's new personal assistant, a sharp-faced woman named Chloe, who looked at Elena with barely concealed pity. "Mr. Vance has ordered a reallocation of floor space. The executive suites are being converted into a war room for the forensic accounting team Janus Capital has flown in." "Forensic accounting?" Elena repeated, her stomach tightening. "And where exactly are Mr. Thorne and I supposed to work?" Chloe pointed down the hall, past the glass-walled offices, toward the bullpen, the open plan area usually reserved for junior copywriters and interns. 2 desks had been cleared in the back corner, near the noisy break room and the server closet. "Temporary stations," Chloe said, though her tone suggested permanence. "Mr. Vance believes that leadership should be accessible." The demotion was physical, spatial, and brutally public. When Marcus arrived 20 minutes later, he threw a fit that could be heard from the elevators, kicking a box of files and threatening to sue. But by noon, he was sitting at the cramped desk, aggressively typing on his laptop, his face a mask of red-hot fury. The real torture, however, began in the afternoon strategy meeting. Elena had spent the weekend redoing the marketing proposal. She had poured everything into it: market analysis, demographic shifts, projected ROI. It was brilliant work, the kind that used to make Marcus brag about her to his golf buddies. She wanted to prove to Ethan that she was still valuable, that she wasn't just part of the debt. She stood at the front of the conference room, a smaller, windowless room on the 30th floor this time, and delivered the pitch of her life. She spoke with passion, her eyes occasionally flicking to Ethan at the head of the table. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't take notes. He spent the entire 20 minutes slowly dismantling a pen and putting it back together. When she finished, the room was silent. Marcus gave a supportive nod, desperate for a win. Ethan finally looked up. "Is that it?" "Yes," Elena said, her confidence faltering. "The Q4 projections show a 20% increase if we pivot to—" "It's pedestrian," Ethan said. He didn't sound angry. He sounded bored. "It's the kind of safe, unimaginative thinking that put this company $40 million in the hole. You're trying to sell luxury to a market that's moved on to authenticity. You don't understand the consumer anymore, Miss Vance. Maybe you never did." "That's unfair," Marcus interjected, his voice tight. "Elena is the best strategist in the city." Ethan turned his gaze to Marcus. "And yet, here you are, bankrupt." He stood up, signaling the end of the meeting. "Scrap the proposal. I want the junior team to take a crack at it. Ms. Vance, you will supervise their coffee runs and ensure they have the data they need. Do not interfere with the creative process." He walked out. Elena stood frozen, clutching the clicker. The junior staff avoided eye contact, shuffling out of the room as fast as they could. "He's doing this on purpose," Marcus hissed, walking up to her. He grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "He's enjoying this, humiliating us." "I know," Elena whispered. "It's because of you." Marcus spat, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "He doesn't care about the money. He hates me because I took you. This is your fault." He shoved past her, storming out of the room. Elena remained alone in the windowless box. The hum of the ventilation system sounded like a slow suffocation. She realized then that Ethan wasn't going to fire them. Firing them would be mercy. He was going to keep them here, in this glass cage, and watch them tear each other apart. The forensic accountants were like termites. They moved slowly, chewed through everything, and left nothing but dust in their wake. For 2 weeks, the gray suits, as the staff called them, had been dismantling Marcus's legacy one receipt at a time. Marcus was not handling the dissection well. It was 9 p.m. on a Thursday. The open-plan office was mostly dark, save for the pools of light around the few desks where fearful employees were still grinding away. Elena sat at her cramped workstation, massaging her temples. She was trying to reconcile a discrepancy in the Q3 budget, a $50,000 expense labeled client relations, that she knew for a fact was a weekend trip Marcus had taken to the Hamptons. She needed to ask him how to categorize it before the auditors flagged it as embezzlement. She stood up, and walked toward the small, glass-walled conference room Marcus had commandeered as his temporary office. The blinds were partially drawn, but the sliver of glass near the door was clear. Elena reached for the handle, then stopped. Inside, Marcus was sitting on the edge of the table. Standing between his knees was Sophie, the 23-year-old social media coordinator they had hired last month. Sophie was laughing, her head thrown back, while Marcus's hand rested, familiarly, possessively, on the curve of her hip. He leaned in and whispered something into Sophie's ear. It was the same lean, the same shark-like charm, the same calculated intimacy that he had used on Elena in her kitchen 7 years ago. "He doesn't suspect a thing, Elle." The memory of the text message superimposed itself over the reality before her eyes. The nausea came instantly, violent and sharp. It wasn't heartbreak. She realized with a jolt that she hadn't truly loved Marcus for years. It was the sickening realization of her own stupidity. She had destroyed a good man, a devoted husband, for this. For a serial predator who needed a constant supply of adoration to fill his own hollowness. She stepped back, her heels clicking too loudly on the polished concrete floor. Inside the room, Marcus looked up. His eyes met hers through the glass. There was no shame in them, only annoyance. He slowly removed his hand from Sophie's hip, but he didn't chase after Elena. He knew he didn't have to. She was trapped in this sinking ship with him. Elena turned and walked blindly toward the elevators. She needed air. She needed to be anywhere but this building. She jabbed the down button, her breathing ragged. The elevator chimed. The doors slid open. Ethan stood inside. He was alone, holding a leather briefcase, looking impeccable even at this hour. He saw her, her flushed face, the tears swimming in her eyes, the way her hands were shaking. He held the open button. "Going down?" he asked. His tone was polite, distant, as if asking a stranger about the weather. Elena stepped in because she had nowhere else to go. The doors closed, sealing them in a box of stainless steel and silence. "He's doing it again," Elena blurted out. The words vomited out of her before she could stop them. She leaned against the handrail, looking at her reflection in the metal doors, so she wouldn't have to look at Ethan. "Marcus, he's with someone else." She waited for a reaction, maybe a smirk, maybe an "I told you so." Maybe, just maybe, a hint of the man who used to hold her when she cried. Ethan didn't move. He watched the floor numbers count down. 30, 29, 28. "That is a personnel issue, Ms. Vance," Ethan said calmly. "If his conduct violates HR policy, you are welcome to file a formal complaint with Chloe." Elena turned to him, stunned by the absolute wall of ice. "How can you be like this? Don't you feel anything? You see me falling apart, and you just, quote, HR policy?" Ethan finally turned his head. His dark eyes swept over her face, noting the grief, but absorbing none of it. 7 years ago, Ethan said, his voice low and steady, "I stood in a hallway and watched my life burn down. I learned then that emotions are a luxury for people who can afford them. I can't afford them anymore, and frankly, neither can you." The elevator dinged at the lobby. "Get some rest," he said, adjusting his cuff. "The auditors are presenting their preliminary findings tomorrow. It will be a difficult day for you." He stepped out into the marble lobby, the click of his shoes echoing with rhythmic precision, leaving her alone in the elevator as the doors began to slide shut again. The Sterling Media Annual Gala was held in the Temple of Dender at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was a setting of ancient stone and water, designed to project permanence and power. Two things Marcus Thorne was rapidly losing hold of. The atmosphere was brittle. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, weaving through a crowd of investors and industry titans who whispered behind their hands. Everyone knew about the acquisition. Everyone sensed the blood in the water. Elena stood near a sandstone column, clutching a flute of sparkling water. She wore a black velvet gown that felt more like mourning attire than a party dress. Across the room, Marcus was holding court, his voice too loud, his laughter too manic. He was drinking heavily, his arm draped around Sophie, parading her as if defying the inevitable. At 9 p.m. the lights dimmed. A spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the podium. Ethan walked onto the stage. The applause was polite, restrained. He adjusted the microphone, his tuxedo immaculate, his expression unreadable. He looked out at the sea of faces, his eyes briefly finding Elena in the shadows before moving on. "Ladies and gentlemen," Ethan began, his voice echoing off the ancient walls. "Tonight was meant to celebrate a merger, a new beginning for Sterling Media." He paused. The silence in the room deepened. "However," Ethan continued, "integrity is the foundation of any architecture, be it a building or a corporation. When the foundation is rotten, you do not paint over it. You excavate." Marcus stopped laughing. He lowered his glass, his eyes narrowing. "The forensic audit conducted by Janus Capital has concluded," Ethan said. He didn't look at his notes. He looked directly at Marcus. "We have uncovered a systemic embezzlement scheme totaling $12 million over the last 5 years. Funds diverted from client accounts into shell companies registered to one individual." A gasp rippled through the room. The whispers turned into a roar. "This evidence," Ethan said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade, "has been turned over to the district attorney's office as of an hour ago." "You liar!" Marcus screamed. He shoved Sophie aside, stumbling toward the stage, his face purple with rage and alcohol. "This is a setup! You're trying to steal my company because you couldn't keep your wife!" The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide berth for his rampage. Marcus reached the stairs of the stage, but two large men in dark suits, not museum security, but private contractors, stepped out from the wings. They intercepted him with practiced efficiency. "Get your hands off me," Marcus bellowed, thrashing as they restrained his arms. "Do you know who I am?" "We know exactly who you are, Mr. Thorne," Ethan said from the podium. He hadn't moved an inch. He looked down at Marcus with a detached, almost clinical pity. "You are a liability, and you are trespassing." As Marcus was dragged toward the exit, shouting obscenities that echoed profanely in the sacred hall, Elena felt a strange sensation. It wasn't fear. It wasn't pity. It was relief. The man who had manipulated her, who had convinced her that betrayal was strength, was finally being seen for what he was: small, greedy, and pathetic. The gala dissolved into chaos. Guests began to flee, phones glued to their ears. Elena remained by the column. She waited until the room had mostly cleared, until the staff began clearing the untouched appetizers. Ethan descended the stage stairs. He walked toward her. He didn't stop until he was a few feet away. "Did you know?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried the weight of a judge's gavel. "About the money?" "No," Elena said, her voice shaking. "I knew he was ambitious. I didn't know he was a criminal." "Ignorance is not a defense, Elena. But the audit shows your signature wasn't on the fraudulent accounts. You're not going to prison." "Thank you," she whispered, tears finally spilling over. "Don't thank me," Ethan replied coldly. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I don't destroy innocent people just to get to the guilty ones. That's the difference between me and Marcus. Ethan, she choked out, taking a step toward him. I am so sorry. For everything. For 7 years ago. I was weak. Yes, Ethan said. He looked at her, and for the first time, the mask slipped just a fraction. Beneath the CEO's armor, she saw the ghost of the husband she had lost, a flicker of profound, exhausted sadness. You were, and that is why we are here. He checked his watch. My driver is waiting. You should go home, Elena. There is nothing left for you here. He turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the vast, empty hall, leaving her alone with the ruins of the life she had chosen. 3 weeks later, the rebranding of Sterling Media began. The gold lettering in the lobby was pried off the wall, leaving faint, ghost-like outlines on the marble where the name had been. Elena packed the last of her belongings into a single cardboard box. It was a lighter load than she expected. 7 years of climbing the corporate ladder, of sacrificing weekends and morals, had boiled down to a stapler, a few notebooks, and a stress ball. The office was quiet. Most of the senior staff had been let go or had resigned in the wake of Marcus's indictment. The new team from Janus Capital was already moving in, young, hungry, and completely indifferent to the history of the building. Elena picked up her box. She could have walked straight to the elevator, but her feet carried her down the hall to the corner office. The door was open. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at the Hudson River. The gray winter light washed over him, softening the sharp angles of his suit. He didn't turn when she knocked on the doorframe, but she knew he sensed her presence. I left my pass card with security, Elena said softly. I'm going. Ethan turned slowly. The cold, predator's edge he had worn since his return was gone, replaced by a quiet, settled calm. He looked at the box in her arms, then up to her eyes. Where will you go? He asked. It wasn't a challenge. It was a simple question. Upstate, maybe, she said, shifting the weight of the box. My sister has a place in Beacon. I need to figure out who I am when I'm not trying to be someone important. She took a breath, the question that had been burning in her chest finally finding its way out. Ethan, did you ever think, even for a second, that we could... No. He cut her off gently. There was no malice in his voice, only the absolute finality of a closed book. The man who loved you, Elena? He's gone. I didn't kill him. You did. And I spent 7 years burying him so I could survive. I miss him, she whispered, a tear escaping. I missed him too for a long time, Ethan admitted. He walked over to his desk, picked up a file, and placed it in a drawer. But I like who I am now. I built this version of myself out of necessity, but it's real, and this version doesn't belong to you. He walked around the desk and stood in front of her, keeping a respectful distance. You are free, Elena. Marcus is gone. The debt is paid. Don't waste the rest of your life looking backward. It's a bad view. Elena looked at him one last time. She wanted to touch his arm, to bridge the gap of 7 years and 1,000 lies, but she kept her hands on the box. He was right. The distance between them wasn't measured in feet. It was measured in scar tissue. Goodbye, Ethan, she said. Goodbye, Elena. She turned and walked out. The sound of her heels faded down the corridor, followed by the soft ding of the elevator. Ethan listened until the silence returned. He didn't feel triumph. He didn't feel joy. He felt weightless. He walked back to the window. Below him, the city of New York sprawled out like a vast electric circuit board, pulsing with millions of stories, millions of secrets. For 7 years, he had been a ghost haunting these streets, driven by a singular purpose. Now, the haunting was over. He checked his watch. He had a meeting with the architects for the new headquarters in Tokyo in an hour. Ethan Vance buttoned his jacket, took one last look at the skyline, and turned away from the window. He walked out of the office, closing the door firmly behind him. The past was dead. The future was waiting.